I want to discuss one of the most important issues facing our nation, the establishment of an Indigenous voice to Parliament. As many of you know, Aboriginal Australians continue to face significant social, economic and political challenges in our country. Despite the efforts of successive governments and communities, Aboriginal Australians continue to experience higher rates of poverty, poor health outcomes and lower levels of education and employment. These challenges are not simply the result of historical injustices or cultural differences, but rather a failure of our political system to recognise and respond to the unique needs and perspectives of Aboriginal Australians. That is why I believe that the establishment of an Indigenous voice to Parliament is essential for our country to move forward and achieve greater equality and justice for all Australians. There are 5 key areas that the voice will address. Self-determination. The proposal for a voice to Parliament is rooted in the principle of self-determination, which recognises the rights of Indigenous people to control their own lives and destinies. The voice would provide a way for Indigenous people to have a direct say in the decisions that affect them, rather than relying on non-Indigenous politicians to make those decisions on their behalf. Reconciliation. A voice to Parliament is seen as a key step towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. It would acknowledge the unique place of Indigenous people in Australian society and help to redress the historical injustices they have faced. Constitutional recognition. A voice to Parliament is seen as a necessary component of any proposal for constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. Without a voice, any constitutional change would be largely symbolic and would not address the ongoing issues of Indigenous disadvantage and marginalisation. Support from Indigenous leaders. Many Indigenous leaders and organisations have expressed support for a voice to Parliament, including the National Congress of Australian First Peoples, the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association and the Australian Council of Social Service. International obligations. Australia has international obligations to protect and promote the rights of Indigenous people, including the right to participate in decision-making processes that affect them. A voice to Parliament would help to fulfil these obligations. The Indigenous voice to Parliament would provide a dedicated platform for Aboriginal Australians to be heard and represented on issues that are specific to their communities and experiences. It would ensure that Aboriginal Australians have a direct say in the policies and programs that affect their lives, that their voices are not overlooked or ignored. But the Indigenous voice to Parliament is not simply about political representation. It is about recognition and valuing the unique perspectives, knowledge and culture of Aboriginal Australians. For too long, Aboriginal Australians have been seen as a problem to be solved, rather than a source of strength and resilience to our country. The establishment of an Indigenous voice to Parliament would help to shift this narrative and recognise the contributions that Aboriginal Australians have made and continue to make to our country. Of course, there are some who argue against the establishment of an Indigenous voice to Parliament. They say that it would create division and undermine the unity of our country. But I would argue that it's precisely because our commitment to national unity that we must establish an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We cannot continue to ignore or marginalise Aboriginal Australians and expect to have truly unified and prosperous nation. The establishment of Indigenous voice to Parliament is not a call for separation or division, but rather a recognition of the unique needs and perspectives of Indigenous Australians within the context of our existing political system. The comment that the voice is the Canberra voice implies that the proposed voice to Parliament is a top-down initiative that will be controlled by the government and will not represent the views of Indigenous people. However, this argument overlooks several key aspects of the proposal. First, the proposal for a voice to Parliament emerged from extensive consultations with Indigenous communities across Australia, and it has been developed in close collaboration with Indigenous leaders and organisations. The voice is intended to be a grassroots movement that represents the diverse views and perspectives of Indigenous people across the country. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is as important to our First Nations people as any other historic agreement that leads to reconciliation. Second, the proposal is designed to be independent of government, with the power to provide advice and input to Parliament and executive branch of government. The voice would be established through legislation, and that members would be appointed by a process that is transparent, inclusive, and based on the principle of Indigenous self-determination. Third, the proposed voice is not intended to replace existing Indigenous representative bodies. First Nations people or Torres Strait Islander Regional Authority, rather it is intended to complement and strengthen these bodies by providing a formal mechanism for their views and perspectives to be heard by the federal government. I urge you to join me in supporting the establishment of an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Let us work together to build a truly inclusive and just Australia. We're all Australians. We're black mob, we're white mob, we're Asian mob, we're Brindle mob, we're one mob. We can thrive and contribute to our shared future. Vote yes to reconciliation. Vote yes to the Voice to Parliament.